Three generations of a family went for 2 weeks camping in the Clearwater region at the Wells-Grey Provincial Park of British Columbia in August 1982. Karen Johnson, 11, and Janet Johnson, 13, were traveling with their parents Jackie and Bob Johnson and their grandparents George and Edith Bentley. The Bentley family frequently went camping, with George Bentley favoring more remote locations. On this particular vacation, the two girls slept in a tent and the adults in the camper attached to George's truck. Bob reserved a couple weeks off from work so that he could go on the camping trip. His manager became concerned when Bob didn't show up for work on August 23, 1982, after he had previously missed a few shifts, and filed a missing persons report for Bob and the rest of the family. Local police in the Wells-Grey region began looking for the family after receiving the missing persons complaint at both public and private campgrounds. However, in the initial weeks of their search, they were unable to find them. A berry picker discovered the Johnsons' burned-out automobile on September 13, 1982, in a remote rural region. As skeletal remains had been discovered in the automobile, British Columbia RCMP Detective Mike Eastham was sent to the site. After testing, these bodies were identified to be George and Edith Bentley's and Jackie and Bob Johnson. Focus shifted to the car's trunk once the corpses were found. When it was opened, Janet and Karen Johnson's remains were visible. Both had suffered fatal head injuries from gunshots. The absence of bullet casings led police to believe that the family had been killed elsewhere. They noticed that in addition to George and Edith's 1981 Ford Camper Special, a boat, motor, and camping supplies were all missing. Police began focusing on locating the missing camper. They advertised it in the local media to assist get as many tips as they could. Shortly after contacting the media, authorities got a tip from a park ranger who said he'd spotted the Bentley's camper parked at Bear Creek a few weeks earlier. Given how long it had been since word of the murder spread, the reason he had waited so long to come forward with the information initially raised few suspicions. The ranger, however, had been at a cabin without TV reception and had learned of the killings only after arriving back in town. On September 14, 1982, the crime scene was located. Bottles of George's favorite beer and boards of wood that may have been used to level off a camper were discovered by police on the crime site. 6 .22 caliber bullet casings were also discovered dispersed around the campground. The camper, however, was not to be discovered. Investigators went knocking on doors and asking locals whether they had noticed anything unusual before the family went missing. Additionally, they worked around the clock to look into the nearly 13,000 tips that were received, 300 of which claimed to have spotted the camper traveling throughout Canada. One such caller reported seeing 2 French-Canadian loggers operating a truck resembling the Bentleys. She was a waitress from Clearwater. She worked with police to create a sketch of the two that was published in the media. The ARCMP drove a similar Ford Camper Special throughout the nation with banners on either side asking people to phone police if they had any information about the vehicle or the murders in order to help keep the case in the public spotlight. Additionally, they would leave it parked in key locations like malls. Detective Eastham would appear on the local news the day before to inform locals about the passing truck. A mechanic from Windsor, Ontario, called in saying he had seen the camper and spoken to the drivers. He claimed that they asked him to paint their truck, which looked a lot like the Bentleys. He asserted that the men asked him to dispose of a rifle for them as well, but he declined. He told them they could find the supplies they needed in Detroit, over the border, and then they left. The tip had given the ERCMP hope of catching a break in the case. However, on October 18, 1983, the camper was found by forest rangers near the summit of Trophy Mountain. The camper had the same burn damage as the car. Investigators were able to recognize it because of burnt but readable license plate. In the rear, there was a bullet hole. The location was remote and close to a gorge, which led investigators to believe that the murderer was a local and that he had attempted to dump the vehicle down the mountain, but it had become trapped in the underbrush. The 2 French-Canadian men's story was then abandoned. The investigators went back to the basics and started knocking on doors once more. When a woman mentioned a local named David Shearing, who had informed her he'd spotted a car with a bullet hole in the Trophy Mountain region, the police was intrigued by this, so they started researching Shearing's past. David Shearing was a logger who had previously been detained for DUI, drug possession, and assault. Many people in the community believed that he had gotten away with killing a local teenager in a hit and run since there was not enough evidence. There were also rumors going around town that he had a thing for little girls. Additionally, it was discovered that Shearing resided close to the crime scene and the two dump sites, so he was familiar with the area's topography. Police conducted a raid on his ranch, discovering the family's belongings as well as a .22 Remington hanging on the wall. What might have been the murder weapon? Shearing was residing in Tumbler Ridge and working in construction at the time. Shearing was brought in to be questioned by Detective Eastham and Constable Ken Leibel. He initially denied the hit and run, saying it was an accident, but they eventually got him to admit it. On questioning why he didn't inform police, he explained that he was concerned about his mother finding out. When the conversation went to the Bentley Johnson murder, the two managed to get Shearing to admit guilt by having him name the crime scene, which had not been made public. Then he explained what happened during the murder. Shearing asserted that the crime was committed on August 10, 1982. He claimed to have been following the family and desired their belongings. He opened fire on George, Edith, Bob, Jackie, and then turned to Karen and Janet as they dozed off inside the tent. He then loaded the bodies into the car, drove it to the location where it was found, set it on fire, and went back for the camper. Initially planning to keep it, he changed his mind after news coverage about the search for Camper. Shearing turned over the family's belongings and reenacted the murder for police after confessing. David Shearing admitted to the second-degree murder charge after being detained, and on April 17, 1984, he was given lifetime prison sentence without possibility of parole for 25 years. It was the first instance in Canadian history when a second-degree murder charge resulted in the maximum sentence being imposed. Detective Eastham went to see Shearing on the day of his sentence in an effort to question the convicted killer because he knew Shearing hadn't been entirely truthful with him during the initial interrogation, and he wanted to know more about the murder. Shearing acknowledged to Eastham that he had been observing Karen and Janet on their camping trip and had desired to be with them. He kidnapped the girls after killing the adults, kept them captive for a week and a half, sexually assaulted them during this time, and then killed them. The Bentley Johnson murders inquiry ended up being one of the most expensive in Canadian history. Detective Eastham stayed employed by the ERCMP of British Columbia until his retirement in 1996 and remembered this case as one of the worst crimes he had ever encountered. David Shearing took on his mother's last name, Ennis, once he was behind bars. He is being detained at the Bowden Institution, which is situated in Alberta to the north of Calgary. Shearing first qualified for parole in 2008, but his application was turned down. His following requests have since either been turned down or he himself decided not to apply for parole. The parole board rejected his plea in 2012 on the grounds that he was still engaging in violent sexual fantasies. Detective Eastham and those related to the Bentleys and Johnsons have attended all of Shearing's parole hearings. Many people have written letters to the parole board requesting them to keep him in prison.